Downgrading the credit rating of the United States, the White House lashes out at what it calls the flawed assessment by Fitch Ratings. But what's worrying the financial experts? And is the world's biggest economy in trouble? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. The credit score of the world's biggest economy downgraded. The rating agency Fitch says it evaluated several factors before lowering America's score from AAA to AA+. At the core of the issue is spending, which many say is out of control. Political divisions also weigh heavily. So will this downgrade sway investors? And what impact will it have in Washington a year before the next US presidential election? We'll get to those issues with our guests in a moment. But first, this report by Katia Lopez-Hodayan.
It's not the assessment the U.S. government was hoping for, but the rating agency Fitch is defending its decision to downgrade America's credit score from AAA to AA+. It says Washington has a major spending problem it hasn't managed to control. Most analysts agree, but say the downgrade hurts the U.S. Treasury's ego more than the economy.
The way I've described it to our clients is that if I was the pilot of an airplane and you were the passenger, it's going to get very bumpy. Put on your seatbelt, but the airplane's not going to crash. We're still going to get to our destination, which I think will be higher than it is today, both the S&P and the Dow.
Majority leaders. The reasons for the downgrade include what Fitch describes as an erosion of government, including contentious last-minute congressional debates in June over the $32 trillion debt ceiling. The attack on the Capitol 2 years ago didn't help. With infighting between Democrats and Republicans brewing for years, analysts say it's now reached a boiling point.
And we are polarized. We're as polarized as we've ever been. We all know that between the Democrats, Republicans, we can't seem to reach agreement on anything.
Investors look at credit ratings to evaluate their own investments and assess risks. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen launched this attack.
Fitch's decision is puzzling in light of the economic strength we see in the United States. I strongly disagree with Fitch's decision, and I believe it is entirely unwarranted.
While a AA+ credit score is still considered very good, some investors say the downgrade inevitably leaves a financial dent, particularly ahead of the U.S. presidential election next year. Katia Lopez-Hodayan for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. William Lees, the chief economist at the American non-profit think tank, the Milken Institute. He's with us live from Henderson in Nevada. From China's capital, Einar Tangen, a senior fellow at the Beijing-based peace and development think tank, Taihe Institute. He's also a former investment banker. And in Rochester, in England, Frances Coppola, an economist and banking commentator. She wrote the book, The People's Case for Quantitative Easing. Welcome to all my guests. Good to have you with us on this edition of Inside Story. William, can I start with you in Henderson, Nevada? The impact for the current situation is far-reaching, both domestically and internationally, short-term and long-term. How do you briefly assess the situation that the US is facing?
Well, the U.S. Treasury market is at the core and foundation of the global financial system because every asset is priced off of U.S. Treasuries. So when Fitch lowers the rating of the U.S. Treasuries, it implies that they have lost confidence or are less confident that the U.S. government is able to contain its spending in a way that keeps the debt rising at the speed of the GDP or the U.S. economy. One of the worst things that can happen is if spending gets out of control and the size of the debt starts to grow faster than the U.S. economy itself is growing, because that implies the U.S. will be less able to pay the outstanding debt. And right now, the government is in a position where it can do something about it. But so far, Fitch is telling us that the government has not done the necessary measures to contain the growth of that debt.
Frances Coppola in Rochester, it really is a shot across the bows, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I think the driver for this actually has been the threat of default caused by the debt ceiling shenanigans. This is not the first time we have had threats of default due to political infighting in the first days. I think since the financial crisis, this is actually the third time. And I think it probably is about time that somebody said, this will not do. You should not play chicken with the world's global system like this.
And we'll talk the specifics of the Chinese angle during the programme. But how do you think Beijing view what's going on in terms of the Fitch downgrade?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's particular to Beijing. You've just heard two commentators, very carefully spell it out. The U.S., if it was not the United States, it would be a Ponzi scheme. Think of it this way. Since 2001, the U.S. has been exceeding its income in terms of spending. That means if you got a salary of $100,000, you are spending more than $100,000. Since 2009, in addition to going into deficit on a yearly basis, since 2009, they borrowed additional money, and that has increased the debt. So the U.S. is in a position now where it's borrowing to pay its debt interest. That's interest on the money it's already borrowed, with no end in sight. As we saw with the, kicking the can down the road, it's really about there is no solution. It polarized everything that my fellow commentators have pointed out. So yes, it's an obvious conclusion. What is only strange is that the other rating houses haven't joined in.
No, William, can I just bring you back in here? Because I think what Janet Yellen is so angry about is the fact that these sorts of downgrades happen to countries that, dare we say, are developing or third world or isolated or under sort of certain regimes. Her feelings have been hurt, but her professionalism perhaps has also been tainted slightly with all of this.
Well, Secretary Yellen actually has focused the discussion onto the subject of economics. And she's right to say the U.S. is still the most powerful country in the world, and is probably the most attractive place for investment money to come into the country. Every country in the world is sending their savings to the United States because the United States is the most productive country in the world. But Fitch is telling us, well, it's not the U.S. economy they're worried about, it's the U.S. politics. They're not confident that the government itself, that both Democrats and Republicans, they're not confident that they will be able to contain the growth of spending. And in this case, it's mainly entitlement spending. The spending for Social Security, health care, which are the main drivers for the rise in spending, that somehow the Fitch is telling everyone, the U.S. government is not able to either raise taxes or contain spending in a way that makes us confident the U.S. government will be able to pay off its debt in the long run.
Well, William, while you were talking, Einar was shaking his head in disagreement and Francis certainly was nodding in agreement. Let's go back to Einar first as to why you were shaking your head in disagreement.
Well, I love this idea that somehow you could cut education, social welfare in a country which has 10.1% poverty already. You have droves of people going to the streets. You have an economy which is pushing a lot of people into default on their homes. Meanwhile, the unlimited spending is going to the military, largest military budget ever. The military was exempted from any kind of decrease. So, this idea that the U.S. is, somehow doing the right thing here is kind of ridiculous. The U.S. has pursued a path of financial irresponsibility. And I'm not saying that from Beijing's point of view. How else can you explain it? We've exceeded our GDP in terms of our national debt. We're second in the world behind Japan, which is around 240 to 250, depending on which day you're measuring it. That's times 250 to 40% above their GDP. So we're in a rarefied era where our strength, yes, we have strength, there is growth, but it's not the kind of growth, nor is there a solution to this debt.
Francis, you were, you've heard both sides of it now, and you were nodding in agreement with William before. Can I just bring you in for a brief answer and reply?
Yeah, I was nodding about the politics because I do think this is a political issue, that the reason why the US can't get control of its spending and can't direct it into the most socially effective and productive areas either. is actually because of the dysfunctional politics. That fundamentally is the heart of the matter. It's the reason for the short-term view and the focus upon things that potentially don't matter as much as, for example, empowering the next generation, educating them, skilling them, and doing something about the demographic time bomb. Just not able to deal with it because the politics is so dysfunctional.
Indeed, we talk about the politics. Let's go back to William, because, you know, we're talking about divided governments or certainly divided US political stances. You know, when it comes to the debt ceiling, we heard so much about it every time, either when the Republicans want to raise it or when the Democrats want to raise it. Heated debates, real worries about where government services will stop, William. This happened, you know, it happens time and time again. They just can't seem to find middle ground. Politics has got very personal.
Absolutely. And in fact, in the United States, politics has become so dysfunctional, as Ms. Coppola said, that the U.S. is not able to decide on priorities. And unfortunately, Einar had a great narrative about the size of U.S. military spending being the source of this problem. But U.S. military spending is only 3% of GDP and 12% of the U.S. budget. So military spending is actually scheduled to shrink as a share of GDP going forward. So the budget actually is taking care of the military spending. It's really the social spending for healthcare. And it's not so much the amount of spending, it's the cost of healthcare, which the U.S. has never been able to get a handle on, going back to President Clinton and his attempt to modify and reform healthcare. So for the United States, it really is a problem of costs going out of hand, and the U.S. government not having the capability of making decisions, hard decisions, on how to contain costs of healthcare.
Let me bring in Francis here, because I think we need a little bit of neutrality here. And you talked about the politics, Francis. You keep talking about the military, and I don't want to get too bogged down about the military, but the Fitch statement did talk about governance over the last 20 years. And within the last 20 years, we have two major military conflicts, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, and the military spending on those two alone has gone into the billions. That is a debt that the American government has to try and pay back because they borrowed money on there. This is actually exacerbating the problem that we're seeing now, post-pandemic, and now the rise in the cost of living, which is affecting all Americans and the public globally as well.
Well, I think we need to distinguish between two things. One is the deficit and the other is the debt. The US has high levels of historic debt, partly because of the wars that it's engaged in the last 20 years. And even before that, I mean, we should remember that, you know, even going back to the Vietnam War has left it with legacy debt. And so the debt level is high anyway. But then on top of that, we have an entrenched deficit. In other words, that every year, all the time, its spending exceeds its revenues. And I think it's from the way I read Fitch's statement, in some respects, it was the entrenched deficit that concerned them more than the debt.
OK, Einar Tangen, let me just come back to you. Let's move the conversation on a little bit more. 2011, Standard & Poor's downgraded the US. At that time, there was panic a little bit. Banks moved to, you might say, bolster up the financial community. This time, there's been no panic. There's been no major moves. Everybody's just got on with it. What's going on? Because at the end of the day, is it China and Japan buy up most of America's debt? And they're happy to do that because, again, there's this whole scenario about the strength of the dollar.
Well, like the big four accounting firms, there are big three in terms of rating agencies, and two of them have maintained their AAA ratings. So it's not really going to matter if, for any reason, one of the other rating agencies downgrades the U.S., then it starts to matter because then it's a signal. A lot of contracts require that at least two rating agencies rate a bond at a certain level. If it's somebody wants absolute safety, they'll say, well, we need two rating agencies who say that this is AAA bonds. If that doesn't things, then there are contracts that, people say, well, I can't buy those. I have to buy something else. I'll buy Norwegian bonds or something like this. So it will make a sense. But I just want to add a little interesting note. 2 weeks after S&P lowered their rating, they were investigated for fraud. The following year, in 2012, a group named Evans, which is a smaller rating house, did the same thing. They downgraded twice, and they were promptly investigated by the FBI, once again, under some sort of fraud theory. They did settle it in the end, but it was not a very happy circumstances. So, I wonder if Fitch is going to be punished by them. Now, I disagree with this idea that, the Treasury Secretary, Yellen, who is a quant, she's somebody who follows the data. I think she's just putting on a show. I mean, she has to be worried about these, yearly deficits, as my colleague has pointed out. It's entrenched. It doesn't change. And then on top of that, more borrowing for wars and pandemics.
Indeed. Francis, can I just come back to you on the whole debate? We talk about the politics. President Biden has actually even inferred that he thinks that the debt ceiling should go. It's perhaps even against the Constitution. This may be a debate that will either head towards a presidential election or may be resolved when the next president is elected. But you need a bipartisan approach, don't you, on these things? So can we expect more bickering and more instability? Because countries like China are watching, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And I don't think we've seen the last of the arguments over the debt ceiling, about whether there should even be a debt ceiling. I mean, whether Congress should be able to authorize spending and then refuse to pay for it, which is roughly what's going on. It all seems, even from where I sit in the UK, it looks ridiculous. It's embarrassing, and it doesn't look like any way to run a country. And, the big buyers of American debt would be looking at this and saying, we want to trust the American savings products that we buy, so US Treasuries, MBS, and what have you. We want to trust the dollar, and yet there's this stuff going on in America which undermines faith in those things. For how long are they going to put up with that?
How long will they put up with it? Because one of the things, I think, William, that many big businesses, certainly in the US, will be wondering is whether we are seen as reliable, because obviously big companies also have to take on debt. They have to borrow. How is this going to affect the big multinationals, the big computer firms, the airline industry, the construction firms?
Well, one consequence of the rating decision, it really has acknowledged what the markets have already seen for quite a while, that the U.S. governance structure is the ability to contain spending is in question. And as a result, the U.S. Treasuries are now having to pay higher interest rates to compensate for that higher risk. So what's going to happen is that for U.S. companies, it's going to be harder for them to raise money. It's going to be harder for them to finance their investment. But that's a consequence of this poor governance structure of the country in which they operate. And I think that's something that most companies have learned to live with and acknowledge that there'll be a higher cost. Now, for those who are holders of the U.S. Treasuries, they'll be compensated with higher interest payments. So again, I think the markets will work itself out in terms of repricing U.S. Treasuries in a way that makes people confident in being able to hold U.S. Treasuries as a source of savings.
In terms of trying to understand the markets, you're shaking your head, Einar. Let's see what you want to say.
Oh, I'm sorry. I completely disagree with my colleague. First off, it's not about containing spending. It's about inflation, and that's why the Fed has been increasing rates. As they've increased the rates, that means people who bought before then, they've seen the value of the treasuries they bought plummet. That's why we've had issues like Silicon Valley Bank going under, as well as others. So I don't even know where you're coming up with this idea that this is somehow about the impossibility of curtailing social spending is the problem. The problem is that the U.S. is less competitive. If you look at inflation, and in terms of wages and where it's going, you'll note that services within the U.S., whether a hospital or education, have soared, literally going up 10 to 12 times, whereas actual goods coming from the rest of the world have remained fairly steady, but in some cases even gone down. So the inflation that the U.S. is facing is of its own making. It's a highly service economy, and when those wages go up, it's not like putting the interest rates higher by the Fed is going to make people feel less sick or decide they don't need an education.
William, I'm going to ask you to come back in. You were shaking your head through all of that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a non sequitur that Anya has just talked about, because inflation is a global problem that resulted from the supply problems caused by the COVID and also the war between Russia and Ukraine. We see that before the COVID, U.S. had for 10 years inflation rates of less than 2%, and the global economy has been in a disinflation period. So the fact that inflation is brought up is really a non sequitur. It's not relevant. What's relevant is that the U.S. Treasury has not been able to sell its bonds at a low interest rate because the markets are slowly losing confidence that they'll be able to get back the same value that they put in. So I think this is a long-term problem that has to do with the size of the deficit, as Francis just talked about, and being able to contain the size of the deficit is the main issue, which Janet Yellen and every other Secretary of Treasury has talked about, and every Federal Reserve chairman has talked about, that the U.S. is on a non-sustainable fiscal trajectory, and we need to contain the size of the deficit, both spending and by raising taxes.
Well, I can see that you guys aren't going to agree on that at all. Let's go back to Francis over in Rochester, because obviously it was only, this week that we saw the Bank of England raise its base interest rate. And I'm just wondering, from where you're positioned in the United Kingdom, how, the Bank of England watches what's going on in America, understands the spending issues and the debt ceiling and why the Treasury is so angry at the Fitch rating. How does raising bank rates in the UK and dealing with inflation relate to what's going on in the US? Because every country's trying to deal with inflation at the moment, aren't they, globally?
Yeah, absolutely. Inflation is a global problem. Inflation in my country is actually worse than in the US at the moment. And I actually don't think it's directly related to the size of the fiscal deficits. I mean, we have a sizable fiscal deficit at the moment because of the COVID pandemic. We had all that in the aftermath of the financial crisis, when everybody was terribly worried about fiscal debts and deficits, and everything was going to go terribly wrong, and it didn't. And I'm wary about raising those as the particular bugbears. And again, because I think some of the policies followed at that time were incredibly damaging. What I would rather focus on, I think, is actually looking at this from a global perspective to see what the drivers of the American deficit are. Because one of the things that I've noticed, and it's been written about by some people like Elaine Ray, for example, is that the US kind of acts as consumer of last resort for the whole world. So if you've got a whole world where lots and lots of countries are trying to follow export-led growth strategies and build up foreign exchange reserves, somewhere has got to run a deficit. And those countries, particularly, and the IMF has commented on this, particularly over the last few years, have been the US and the UK. And I don't think it's any accident that those are the countries actually that really have the biggest problem with inflation.
Einar Tangen, can I just come back to you? Because China has been pushing over several years to push the yuan as an alternative to the dollar. It's made no secret in that respect. But it's backed off recently. What's going on there? Is it because the dollar is too established and too strong and globally recognised as a reliable fund and money to actually invest in? Why is there, perhaps, dare I say it, no faith in the yuan, or is that still work in progress?
Well, I think you're mischaracterizing. I don't think that they lack faith in it. They're the ones who've been putting together a digital currency. They've been playing that out, doing it very slowly. They want to make sure that it works. They are also doing currency swaps with a lot of the nations that they are doing business with. Remember, China has about over 100, almost 120 nations where it is the primary trade contributor, one way in terms of both-way trade. But, let's be saying, I don't understand where my colleagues are coming from. I would really like them to tell what they just said to the man on the street. In the U.S., people have lost 4% of their real income due to inflation. Europe, even more. Great Britain as well, saying that inflation somehow doesn't matter. I find that highly strange, given that the U.S. is focused on it, that it's raising rates and forcing other countries to do exactly the same. In terms of China, it's not letting off, but this is a time of great uncertainty. This is not the time to push forward. There's obviously some coming up at the BRICS meeting. It's coming up next in the near future. They will be looking at a BRICS currency. I don't know how far that's going to go, but it's not about replacing the dollar. The U.S. Violated the terms of its own agreement not to weaponize SWIFT. That's a system that settles bank accounts on a daily basis, so everything can square out. It has to be very, very secure because you have so many transactions. And it was the U.S. who said they would never do that. They would never weaponize it, and then did. The U.S. is routinely now using it as a weapon against any country it doesn't view as following its criteria, and that includes a lot of countries right now. So at this juncture, you have a situation where China is trying to be an adult in the room, and the U.S., as my colleagues have pointed out, does not have its house in order.
Well, it certainly seems to be like that. But we're coming to the end of the program. I just want to get Francis's opinion and William's, because really, if we move this on now, we're coming to two huge general elections in the United Kingdom and in the US in 2024. Francis, can I come to you first? Because, international relations, the special relationship between the United Kingdom and America is one of those things that they can never be broken. Yet both administrations don't always quite see eye to eye. But when it comes to finances and inflation, are they working together? How do you assess the way that they're trying to conduct and deal with inflation and the problems that the general public has at large, as Einar mentioned, some of them losing their homes?
Yeah, I think both countries are really paddling their own canoes on this. The Fed is trying to get inflation under control its way, and that is its primary consideration. And obviously the other mandate of unemployment, and it's doing well on that. It's not going to be concerned about what's going on in other countries. And similarly, the Bank of England's responsibility is the domestic economy of the UK, and it'll only take guidance or follow the lead of the Fed to the extent that the British economy is affected by global forces, in particular by things like the strength of the dollar and the cost of energy, which is priced in dollars. So it's not where the US leads, the UK follows, as it's often portrayed. It's really more that there's sufficient dependence between the UK and the US for the.
Let me just get a final comment then. Sorry to butt in there, Francis. We are coming to the end. A final comment, William, from you. I mean, is this going to be a huge issue as we lead towards a presidential election now?
Absolutely, and the U.S. remains the most powerful country in the world, and that's why its currency is being used for every transaction around the world. And the U.S. government and politics going forward is going to have to ensure that the U.S. Position continues to be the most powerful country, and that people remain confident that the U.S. dollar can be used.
Well, we'll see what does happen. It's been great to speak to all three of you. Thanks to my guests, William Lee, Einar Tangen and Francis Coppola, for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you, too, as well, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail, Rahman, and the whole Inside Story team, thanks for your time and your company.